I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to our conversation with Professor Priscilla Dunk-West. This week I thought we'd talk about boundaries and boundary management. Remember that old cliche? If you want space, then move to Utah. But how do we construct a private life in a social media age? This is a tough issue, but also with this cliche of bringing your whole self to work. My question is always, should we do that? Is the workplace a location for a whole self? So let's talk with Priscilla and gain her incredible expertise about boundary management when everything sort of seems a bit porous and permeable. Priscilla, you and I, you're so much younger than me, but we share a lot of interests in boundaries, how we as human beings have personal boundaries and professional boundaries. But how important is it in our universities as a workplace that we differentiate between our professional lives and our personal lives?
It's such a tricky question because a lot of the work that I've done around professional identity making and thinking about professional identity is around being able to grow your professional self. And the professional self, as I see it, and in my sort of opinion, grows from yourself. It grows, you've got to be yourself. You've got to be congruent, as Carl Rogers said, around, how you are in the world and how you are relationally with other people. Lovely. In your professional self. You can't just pretend to be nice. You can't pretend to care about injustice. No. And so that's one sort of framework. And I guess if you carry that through that framework when thinking about boundaries is the boundaries are kind of have to be a bit permeable. They've got to be a bit flexible. And so we can't be thinking about it in a binary kind of way. And some of the really interesting and helpful additions to the literature have us thinking about our notion of being a professional and how it's kind of grounded in Western sort of ways of thinking about identity that are in which, the self is very individualised and separate from community or separate from relationships with family or kin or communities. So those kind of, more thick descriptions, I guess, are important to be thinking through when we think about professional and personal boundaries. However, I'm not going to rock up to work wearing an outfit that I would wear on the weekend. I'm someone who uses, dresses in a particular way in my workplace.
Magnificently, can I say? Magnificently.
Thank you. I'm not the same person at home on the couch as I am in my workplace. No. And so it would be, it wouldn't be true to say that myself in my work is myself at home. And of course, our friend Goffman, I love George Herbert Mead for the interactionist kind of notion of self and identity and the way you produce identities through social interactions. But, Goffman, I love him for this stuff around the front stage, backstage, and the way that we sort of interact with other people and the performance of ourselves, the performance of identity. And so in that sort of, if we think about that as a kind of theoretical framework to understand boundaries, it then hooks into what are the social norms in your organisational context, what are the rules of engagement, what are the policies that frame our behaviour, what are the regulatory environments that operate around universities. And so in that way we're sort of connecting up to those frameworks, I guess, that shape behaviour. And the behaviour that's shaped has a kind of professional boundary around it. It's a very messy answer.
No, it's a bloody magnificent answer. And I was thinking, it's Goffman front stage. It's Goffman front stage. And of course, who knew this was a thing? But Goffman has suddenly become, he's back. He's become this sort of thing again. And I think it's because of social media that, LinkedIn is all front stage. What is going on in LinkedIn? But, the notion of talk and interaction. But having reread his work, including his PhD recently for some of the work I've been doing, Priscilla, mate, the bit I'd forgotten of his argument was we test ideas in the backstage, and if they work, then they poke through the front stage. So the notion of, remember that old cliche, bringing the whole self to work? Actually, no, we are bringing the tested self, the self that had been evaluated and passed a series of protocols. That's the self we bring to work. Unbelievable. But again, I'm going to ask the question. I'm really selfish on this one because I have not resolved this one in my life, mate. Now, you and I both grew up during the time we went to university, during the time with the slogan, the personal is political. And I was there, and Sasu and Erigray, and I'm there, mate. I'm there, right? But the problem is, that was a way to bring feminism into our lives, into our professional lives. But do you still agree with that slogan? In fact, my concern is, can the personal is political? Can that reveal the problems in the contemporary workplace? Where are you on that now?
I don't know. I'm the same as you, I think. I'm not. I don't know if I'm going to offer.
You always do.
Am I in a camp? I don't know. I think, and in social work we talk about, private issues and public troubles, and that conditions that people experience individually should be seen as social issues. And so, the private public stuff for me is still resonates because, this is the argument, is that, traditionally the things that happened in the home or that happened to particular groups of people like women were characterised through silencing, and it wasn't seen as important, therefore not in the public discourse. And so, yes, there's that. But then there's also the critique of the idea, which is around, the emergence of, seeing, well, probably intersectionality, right?
Yes.
Like seeing identity in different ways. That's not just that white Eurocentric kind of cisgendered notion of women as a category that all fit in the same camp, because social conditions are experienced differently, and also this understanding that power is experienced differently, and you can feel and be oppressed in one way but then have privilege in other ways. And so that sort of messiness disrupts that idea for me. But I think fundamentally the silencing of issues is important in relation to power and in relation to public discourse. And the thing that I see happening now, which theorists have picked up on, is the framing of speaking out against a sort of social injustice or a personal injustice as the answer to remedying that injustice, and it's not, right? And so this is I'm always banging on about this, but speaking out about something doesn't necessarily change it, because it creates a false kind of sense of actually doing something about it and addressing it. It's not enough just to speak out against it.
A front stage of politics, indeed, because when we had that phrase, we configured politics, I believe, as public domain politics. So the personal is political was a way to bring private politics into public politics. That was great. As you said, cis women and work and childcare as work and domestic, and fantastic stuff. But I would argue in the last 30 years, the very nature of politics has changed. And not necessarily in a good way, can I say, through neoliberalism. So politics is now, I've done a post on Instagram about Palestine, and I'm right on with my politics. And politics is about struggle. And, I think about E.P. Thompson. I do a lot of work on E.P. Thompson, and he, was great on the anti-nuclear, campaign for nuclear disarmament and so forth. But he also did the committee work to build the communities up, to build these political forces up, and to advocate change in government. And political work is active stages and scaffolding steps. And I think, again, that front stage of, I've done a post on Instagram and you haven't, so you're not political, whereas actually that's where the silence that you've talked about so brilliantly, you're quietly getting on with doing the difficult work rather than all front stage.
That's exactly right. And I've seen that play out as well around, why haven't you said something? Why haven't you said something about this? And it ignores all the activism that happens in lots of different ways. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think we've solved some issues there. We've solved some issues here. Now, of course, my obsession, and you sort of walk me back from this cliff on multiple occasions, but I think a lot about bullying and gaslighting because I've seen it, poor Steve had to put up with it, and it destroys lives, right? But can boundary management in a workplace reduce the likelihood of bullying and gaslighting, or is that sort of putting the cart before the horse, to use that dreadful metaphor? Can boundaries assist management or preventing bullying and gaslighting?
I think the idea of a boundary or a personal boundary is a conceptual framework that we use to think about reining in the sphere of focus to our own behaviour, to our own sets of practices, to our own sense of self. And obviously in the environments that you're talking about where there's bullying, gaslighting, it's really important obviously to think about safety and think about well-being, and that those things have to be at the forefront. And we don't want to fall into a trap of saying that if you had better boundaries you wouldn't be bullied.
That's right.
And so that's that individualisation of an issue that is an institutional issue and a culture issue in an institution. So again, looking at policies and frameworks and culture of institutions can help people to understand what's happening, and perhaps even in retrospect, perhaps even if somebody's out of the institution and has survived some awful experience around bullying, to think back about what was the institutional framework and what was going on. But I think in terms of your own agency, it can be helpful to think about boundaries, personal boundaries, as being about the limits to your behaviour or understanding yourself, and what is it that you need to thrive in a space in work, and where is that threshold when it stops, it stops you in your tracks. And so, yes, helpful to be thinking about your own, but you can't, the thing about that idea of boundaries is that you can't put that onto other people. It's about your boundaries. They belong to you. They're about you and what you're prepared to put up with. And there's a whole different... I did actually recently read an article around this, around bullying within academia. Yeah. And there's a study. We should put a reference to this study because it was really fascinating. Really around 50% of people had experienced bullying in universities. Yep. This was from a US study. Yeah. And so, really common in really unfortunately common. Yeah. And so, people having to deal with those things in that organisational context can be, life-changing, as you've said. Yeah. And so I think thinking about your own boundaries in terms of how do you want to work, what do your relationships look like, what are the ingredients you need to thrive, what are the support frameworks around yourself in terms of connection to other people outside of the institution, and in a sense all of those sorts of ways of thinking about the support around an individual could be thought of as boundaries. Yes. In terms of, I'm someone who works really well in the mornings and I like getting up early and so if I was in a workplace where I had to work really late at night, that that might be a boundary, for example. Yes. And so there's lots of different boundaries around practices of work. So thinking about yourself and what you need to thrive, I think, maybe help maybe help people set those boundaries, perhaps.
Look, that's helping me enormously, Priscilla, mate, because as someone who studied a lot of bullying, the bullies use personal information, use any information they have to leverage it against you, right? So, of course, I don't have your expertise. That's the gift of social work, is my expertise is, well, therefore you keep your private life very, very far away so it can't be used by other humans. But, of course, as you've rightly said, that's allowing bullies to get away with, that's again, blaming the victim.
Yep. Absolutely. And
wow,
if someone's going to weaponize something, they're going to weaponize something. It could be that, it could be something that you have no choice around, somebody else knowing, that you went for a promotion, or you were working in another, it could be something that you don't see as deeply personal, but it's not necessarily professional. So I think, I completely hear what you're saying, and it's a really interesting area, and we don't want to ever blame victims.
No. And of course what that does is, for humans, and it's often women, and can I say the bullying in Australia is particularly in regional universities, what it does is it renders us small and compressed. So we've got to be small, and if we can just get small enough, we'll prevent bullying. And of course, as you've said, this is nonsense.
Yeah.
Can I finish with the final question? And again, this has helped me a lot. You've really, you sorted me out here. You've sorted me out, mate. But using your expertise, do you have proxies or indicators that you've seen in your research that can help us form boundaries? So at least we're aware if someone is pushing at us and pushing our personal and professional boundaries, and we're not feeling comfortable, we're feeling discomfort. Have you got any proxies to know, something's going wrong here, I need to recalibrate, or I need to report it, I need to do something with policy?
It's so different for each person. It depends on, some people are, and it depends on people's, neurodivergent people, for example, might have particular ways of thinking through things. So it's around cognition and ways of thinking and ways of making sense of the world. And so that's going to differ for each person. For me, I love talking through things. You may have guessed this about me.
You're amazing.
Love a chat. And so, but you need relationships with colleagues and potentially outside of the institution.
Wow. And
so having those threads that are, where you're thinking about connections external to the institution. In social work we have this idea of reflexive practice. Yes. So it's around, using those opportunities to really think about yourself, because you may have that feeling of discomfort, but you may not know where that comes from.
Yes.
And something might be pushing up against a boundary that you have, but if you can't articulate it or notice it, then that's not going to help you identify where to go from there. No. So if it's a boundary like that example I gave before about working late, so say there's a culture in a workplace where everybody's working late, everybody goes out for drinks, and there's that sort of social aspect to it, and that's expected, and there's a discomfort with that. Like, what does that look like, and why is that? And then what is the I always think about policy as a sort of framework that can help shape sense making in that process. And so thinking about, codes of conduct, thinking about what are the expectations of behaviour in this workplace, can just help to just frame it in a way that makes sense and validates what you're feeling, that, discomfort.
I think that's powerful. So where we finish this conversation is, it is about having good policy and good procedure, and I agree with that. That's great for a workplace, but also, as you've said, taking the policy and the procedure for a walk, having it in a meeting, speaking about it, and making it a meaningful framework for a productive discourse. So no one is silenced or minimised, or their behaviour is seen to be, this is not how we behave here. And I think that word fit, that is so often used in workplaces these days, is a way to try and cut off the differences from people and create a normative culture rather than a proper, diverse workplace culture.
Yes, yes. And we love diversity.
We love diversity, and and fit is antithetical to diversity. Oh, that's controversial. I could be wrong. Doug will tell us whether or not I'm right on this. You rock, Doug. So, Priscilla, my love, thank you for this. This has really helped my thinking about boundaries in a tough time for a lot of workers out there. So, thank you.
Thank you.